By the summer of 1864, the center of the American Civil War hovered around the center of Virginia. Richmond was the Confederate capital. Virginia was the home state of Confederate Commander Robert E. Lee. No rebel state had provided more generals, more soldiers, or more funding than did the Old Dominion. And it was Virginia where the rebel cause would end in the spring of 1865. The siege of Richmond and Petersburg began in June 1864 in the wake of the Overland Campaign. The siege would last for 292 days. Richmond was the Confederate capital, but Petersburg, only 23 miles to the south, was its chief supply hub. The Weldon, South Side, and Richmond and Petersburg railroads converged there. They carried food, ammunition, uniforms, reinforcements, horses, medical supplies, and industrial materials into the Confederate capital. In that light, Union Commander Ulysses S. Grant understood that Petersburg mattered more strategically than Richmond itself. If Petersburg fell, Lee's army could not be supplied. And that meant that Richmond would become impossible to defend. With that in mind, Grant concentrated on cutting the railroads feeding Lee's army. As the siege of Richmond and Petersburg settled in, both armies dug dozens of miles of trenches. It was a grim foreshadowing of the trench warfare of World War I. Nearly 250,000 soldiers eventually became engaged in the conflict. Blue and gray bombarded each other throughout the siege. One 13-inch Union mortar was nicknamed the Dictator. Although Union forces greatly outnumbered the Confederates, Lee's army was able to hold for months because of the entrenched defenses. Soldiers lived in the crowded trenches and damp dugouts. They were often surrounded by mud, stagnant water, and human waste. Winter brought cold snow and freezing rains. The men often lacked proper shelter, blankets, or dry clothing. Disease spread through the camps during the long stalemate. Dysentery, typhoid, malaria, and pneumonia killed thousands. Additionally, starvation, desertion, and shrinking supplies further diminished the Confederate Army. In June of 1864, Pennsylvania miners serving in General Ambrose Burnside's Union Army began building a 511-foot-long tunnel underneath Confederate defenses. On July 30th, 1864, Union forces used the tunnel to detonate an explosion that created a crater roughly 170 feet long, 60 feet wide, and 30 feet deep. Hundreds of Confederate soldiers were killed instantly. But the crater plan backfired. Northern forces entering the crater were soon trapped by the Southerners and suffered heavy casualties. The crater incident ended as a terrible failure. Grant called it the saddest affair I have witnessed in the war. General Burnside was relieved of his command. As the months dragged on, Richmond civilians endured food shortages, inflation, hunger, and rioting. The Confederate government increasingly relied on teenage boys and elderly men to reinforce shrinking defensive lines. Grant pressured Lee's army relentlessly. Throughout late 1864 and early 1865, Union forces repeatedly pushed westward to sever the rail lines that converged at Petersburg. By the spring of 1865, Lee's army was exhausted, starving, and running out of options. On April 2nd, Union breakthroughs finally shattered the Petersburg defenses. Lee knew then that he could no longer defend Petersburg and Richmond. April 2nd was a Sunday. Jefferson Davis was in church that day when he received word from Lee that Richmond would be given up. The president paled and quickly left, a signal to other congregants of the impending doom. Word spread through the city. That night, Confederate forces evacuated. In retreat, they set warehouses and supplies on fire to prevent their capture. The night of April 2nd, mobs entered the streets of Richmond and spread the fires. The flames quickly got out of control and destroyed much of the city's business district, a far greater economic and commercial damage than what Sherman and his men caused in Atlanta, Georgia, or Columbia, South Carolina. Union troops entered Richmond on April 3, 1865. The next day, President Abraham Lincoln arrived to survey the scene. Escorted by 10 sailors, he walked the streets of the decimated capital city. Lincoln was soon surrounded by a crowd of black Richmonders shouting, "Glory to God," and "Bless the Lord," and in reference to Lincoln, the great Messiah. One man knelt before him, but Lincoln said, "Don't kneel for me. That is not right. You must kneel to God only and thank Him for the liberty you will enjoy hereafter." The victorious General Grant was not in Richmond that day. He was already in dogged pursuit of Lee and what remained of the Confederate force. 5 days later, on April 9, 1865, the war's two principal generals would meet in person at Appomattox Courthouse.